We are very far from the end of this crisis. I mean, we are very much at the midst of it. If we look at where this third wave is manifesting itself, it is, of course, in Europe, but also in many other parts of the world, like India and Brazil, in parts of the emerging economies, large countries, where the third wave is more likely to produce the new mutations of the virus. So we are really locked into that race between our ability to produce a vaccine adjusted to the evolution of the virus, and the virus, of course, that is adjusting perhaps faster than we can forecast. So what we are thinking, or we were thinking a year ago when we were talking to our clients, that this will be a 5-year crisis. At that time, that sounded like a very, very conservative estimate. Today, I think more and more experts are saying that it is a 10-year pandemic. It is a 10-year crisis, and we should be thinking about that sort of time frame. And both from the public health perspective, but also from the perspective of potential disruptions of various kinds, and of course, very importantly, impact on businesses, on behavior of customers, on supply chains. The second point to make is that the recovery, which is very much underway in parts of the world already, not only in China, but in many other economies, maybe not so much in Europe for the time being, although I do agree with Tina that we are likely to see it coming at the second half of the year, maybe the third quarter of this year. But clearly, recovery is going to be highly fragmented. And we're already seeing the pandemic itself, of course, exacerbating inequality and fragmentation across the world. But the pace of deployment of the vaccines and method of deployment is going to exaggerate those inequalities and fragmentation even further. And we, of course, are seeing, some parts of the world where governments are not able to control fully their territories, where there's still non-state groups that are controlling territories, where we might not see any deployment of the vaccines at all in the foreseeable future. So those pockets of resentment or pockets of instability, entrenched instability, are going to be formed. And of course, those pockets are going to have an impact on global security, on supply chains, on irregular migration flows, particularly into Europe. And Italy, of course, here is on the front line of many of those irregular migration flows, but also on criminality and other, disruptive trends that all businesses are now experiencing. I think it is also very important to say, that we are, now, living through the time when there is a fundamental change and transformation in kind of political risk. It is interesting, I think, from our perspective, that during the pandemic year, the domestic politics really held relatively well. We have not seen, major, political crises. Of course, United States experienced, political turbulence. We've seen, increase in protests. But so far, we have not really seen a major kind of political collapse internally, while at the same time, cooperation globally in terms of global governance, international cooperation on vaccine development have been less than optimal. It's been really very disappointing. I think going forward, we are likely to see the reversal of those trends. We're likely to see the political instability really moving more towards domestic politics, as many of the countries are starting to reckon with the record of their governments during the pandemic, but also, managing this kind of fallout from the end of, furloughs and tackling more entrenched unemployment. While I think global cooperation is actually likely to improve going forward, particularly as we are going to overcome this kind of hurdle when the shortage of vaccines, and supply of vaccines is much below the demand levels. I think at some point later this year, we probably will reach certain equilibrium where the supply will be, just as big or maybe even greater than demand in parts of the world. So we will be able to really offer, more vaccine to other countries. So as global cooperation improves, I think the domestic political instability is likely to escalate. Now, the final point is about the silver lining. I mean, we certainly had seen some positive trends as well, and I do agree that many businesses, including large corporates, are having quite a positive outlook for the future. A number of surveys really indicate that companies think that they are today more competitive and more better positioned to embrace the next wave of technological change than they would have been before the pandemic. That's, I think, a very interesting conclusion. It is also, I think, quite interesting to see that many companies, not only in the developed world, but also in the emerging economies, according to the latest World Bank survey, 51% of all companies around the world have undertaken a major innovation during the pandemic, even in the countries which have not seen a major lockdowns. So the rates of digitalization has increased, including in the emerging economies, and that is going to deliver growth and deliver really accelerate structural change in the economy and open new opportunities. I think another positive outcome was that many regions of the world have strengthened their regional economic cooperation. And of course, finally, at a more kind of operational level, companies have invested heavily in strengthening their resilience, in improving their risk monitoring plans and processes. And it is very interesting also to see that most of the companies believe that the COVID was good for their resilience. At the same time, Europeans continue to be behind North American companies and global companies overall in their level of preparedness and resilience levels. So European companies still have work to do to improve their risk analysis, mitigation, and also, of course, looking and planning for new emerging risks.